5, we'll be looking at the meeting between the US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And we look at the key details of that meeting, what are the key takeaways from the meeting. And let's even understand the background. Let's give a background, a historical background chronologically to how all of this started. Um, a lot of people look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine of 2022 and are not interested in looking at the background to the story and how it all started. This has always been a low intensity war or conflict that has been going on since 2014 after what they call the Euromaidan movement of 2014. But before we go into all of that, we have to look at the reason, the rationale, and the motivation behind this meeting in Alaska, the choice of Alaska, the history of Alaska itself. It used to belong to the Russians. They sold it for around $7 million or thereabout, around the period of 1860s or thereabout, to the Americans. So the choice of Alaska is very interesting. And the fact that the US President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have decided to meet on US territory, on US soil, in order to thrash out the modalities or the way forward to bringing an end to this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Trump have always insisted that this is a war initiated by his predecessor, Joe Biden. Well, a lot of people think otherwise. They think that the Russians have become too aggressive and are pushing the envelope too much that they have decided to launch this illegal war against Ukraine. So let's look at the key details of this meeting as we begin the conversation. Now, in a high-profile summit on American soil, the US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin met yesterday, which is on the 15th of August 2025, um, in a joint base ML Richardson in Anchorage, Alaska. Now, the goal, a potential peace deal to end the war in Ukraine, and the result of this, no agreement. No agreement was reached during the course of this meeting. Now, both leaders described the talks as productive, but no ceasefire or framework was announced. President Trump said that there's no deal until there's a deal. So basically, they see some positive signs. There is um, real conversation have been had in respect of how to bring an end to the conflict. The Americans are insisting on an immediate ceasefire as a pathway for bringing an end to the conflict, and the Russians are saying if we are going to have a ceasefire, we need some guarantees because it has happened before that anytime there is a ceasefire, that the Europeans use that as an avenue, they use that as a gap, as an opening to load Ukraine with more weapons to re-strategize and allow Ukraine to, reposition their forces, to train, new combatants and send them to the front line. But the Russians said we will not have any ceasefire. The pressure will continue on Ukraine until either we get what we want diplomatically or we get it on the battlefield. The signs are there now. It is clear at this point that Ukraine will lose land. It is clear at this point that Crimea would never, never, never go back to Ukraine. It is clear at this point that the Russians want to maintain dominance on the Black Sea. They are going to emasculate Ukraine, denude Ukraine, remove Ukraine, remove any sort of heavy weaponry that the Ukrainians have acquired during the course of this conflict, either sent to them by the Americans or by the Europeans. So, like I said, both leaders described the talks as productive, but no ceasefire or framework was announced, with President Trump saying that there's no deal until there is a deal. And the Russians also agree with that. The Russians came there with a high level delegation. Like I said, this happened in Alaska, in a joint military base in what they call in Anchorage. It's a joint base ML Richardson in Anchorage. So the summit, however, was full of symbolism. It marked Putin's first visit to the West since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, complete with a red carpet welcome. They gave him a red. This is the same guy that the Europeans, in quotes, want the ICJ, the ICC to arrest and so on and so forth. And they gave him a red carpet welcome in Anchorage in Alaska. Trump has never been so excited. This is the first time I see President Trump really happy to meet another world leader. He's excited. He was all over the moon to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin during the course of this meeting in Anchorage. Now, like I said, it marked President Putin's first visit to the West since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, complete with red carpet welcome. However, critics argue that the meeting between Putin and Trump gave President Putin some legitimacy without any real progress, meaning that it's an opportunity for Putin to present himself, you know, with the cloak of legitimacy that he has, while Zelensky is being isolated. Zelensky was not invited to the meeting. In a meeting that the menu, the topic of discussion is Ukraine, how to carve up Ukraine. So this is the point. At the end of the day, you can describe it whichever way you want. Ukraine is on the table, and Ukraine is going to be partitioned. Ukraine is going to be demilitarized. It's going to be denazified. The Europeans will have no say, because what the Europeans are saying is that they must be on the table. The Europeans are insisting that no argument or conversation can be had without them, and they are urging Ukraine to continue fighting until the very last man. So this is what they are saying, that they want Ukraine to fight until the end. Yeah. Hey guys, she's going to be showing you guys as I continue my presentation. She's going to be showing you the food that she has. Yeah. Welcome. Yeah, I'm actually doing a presentation here, so yes, more or less, I won't be able to engage that much. Yeah. So like I said, the U.S. President Donald Trump was all over the moon. He was very happy to meet President uh, Putin. Now, Zelensky said that the ultimate decision has to lie with Ukraine, and of course, the Europeans are also insisting on that. So, President Putin insisted that peace talk must address what he called the root causes of the conflict, while Trump suggested that Ukraine and its President Volodymyr Zelensky must ultimately decide whether to accept the deal. Well, it seems to me that all of them have agreed that there's a deal in place, that that there will be progress made on the field in terms of land concession and other stuff. But President Trump is saying that the end result is not in his hands, that Zelensky will be the one to make the ultimate call. Now, reactions in Washington and the allied, nations, were mixed, and some of them warning that the summit was more of a spectacle than more than about substance, and that it just gave President Putin, the legitimacy and gave him, more clout than he needed, and so on and so forth. By the way, I'm still going to show you my screen for you guys to see what the Russian press is saying, what the press in London and in France and in the other European capitals are saying, and even in America, a lot of them are angry with this. And these are the same Democrats that started the war, right? And they want the war to continue. It's not just the Democrats; it's a bipartisan, attempt to weaken Russia. They hate the Russians, absolutely hate the Russians. For what reason, I have no idea. So, what are the key takeaway from this meeting in Alaska between President Trump and President Putin? Now, the key takeaway number one: no peace deal was reached. Now, despite the high expectations, the meeting ended without a ceasefire or peace agreement. However, Trump said there is no deal until there's a deal, which is basically the point about no peace deal. Now, symbolic win for Putin. Analysts are saying that since this is the first meeting of between President Putin and Trump, including his second tenure. There's a guy, a brother from Sudan in the comment that knows what I'm talking about. What happened? Against the other local tribes, like the Jesus Christ, the Masalit and the Zagawa. My phone just started talking. Oh my god. I don't know. I think it's coming from maybe me trying to download from my one of my live stream. Or yeah, okay. Anyways, let's continue the conversation. I'm sorry, guys. So I've talked about the two key takeaways. No peace deal was reached. The second one was symbolic win for Putin, and the third one is diplomacy without transparency. This is what people think. This is what they feel. You see, Jay, my people are in love with you. That's why they're coming over there. Yeah. Now, Ukraine is still central. Trump emphasized that any deal depends on President Zelensky's approval, and allies stressed that peace cannot be negotiated without Ukraine at the table. Now, the fifth one is there's a mixed global reaction in terms of supporters of both Trump and Zelensky, of Putin and Zelensky having like different opinions about it, while the neutrals are also having their own opinion. Critics, however, say that Trump gave Putin legitimacy without securing concession. Now, supporters hailed the talks as a step towards a dialogue. What is the next step? It is unclear. I don't know whether or not Trump is ready to meet Putin again, or would that be like some sort of tripartite conversation between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin? Now, so the bottom line here is that the Alaska summit was historic in symbolism but empty in substance. Now, raising questions about whether it marked the beginning of serious peace efforts or just a political theater. Now, what I want to do today is to give you guys a chronological background and understanding of how we got to this place. How did all of this begin? I don't want to go back to the 90s after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't even want to go further back as the idea that Nikita Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine in 1956. I don't want to go back to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and how the Bolsheviks came to power and kicked out the Red Army and the I think Tsar Nicholas or the last you know leader of imperial leader of Russia was kicked out by the Bolsheviks, which were basically a gang of communists that ganged up in Germany and came and overthrew the monarch in Russia. So we can go as far back as the 1800. But I want us to begin from 2014. This is where it all started. And what happened in 2014? What they call the so-called Orange Revolution or thereabout. So it's important for us to have an understanding of the origin of this Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, the Russo-Ukrainian War, as they call it, began in 2014 after Ukraine's revolution of dignity toppled the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. And because of that, the Russians decided to step into Crimea, seized and annexed Crimea, and backed different separatists, in the Donbass, sparking a grinding conflict. And this conflict has been going on since 2014. And however, this happened under Obama. The Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, state clearly that they worked with the CIA to pump dissidents in Ukraine with a lot of money in order to topple the government of Viktor Yanukovych, which they saw as closely aligned to the Kremlin. And what led to this was the economic downturn, was the economic issues that happened from 2018 until that period, and Ukraine needed a bailout. So they had two deals in place, either to take a trade deal from the Russians or to take a trade deal from the Europeans as a pathway of joining the European Union. Eventually, Viktor Yanukovych decided to shun the Europeans and decided to go with Russia. And this provoked the Europeans who decided to work with the Americans. And they always have this idea of surrounding Russia. If you take a look at the map, for instance, you see you see that this stuff has been on for a while, and the idea of surrounding Russia, has gone too far for too long. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we know how that happened when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he said that the Soviet project was unsustainable, and he came with the idea of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. These are the two policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, glasnost and perestroika. So he decided to deregulate the economy and decided to give autonomy to the regions. And what happened? That led to the collapse of the Soviet Union with countries like Georgia, and the Baltic countries like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all of them breaking away. And they had an agreement with the Europeans and with the Americans, all of it tentative, informal agreement that NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east, meaning the sphere of influence of Russia. Why did I mention NATO? Because at that time the two rivals were the Warsaw Pact, which was led by the Soviets, and NATO on the other hand. So these were the two military alliances. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it brought the demise of the Warsaw Pact. So, but fast forward to 98 or around 2001. Before then, even Clinton and his people have decided to bring other countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union to join NATO, and it continued with the Baltic countries as well, right around the period, the early 2000s, and it continued to expand. So the idea of bringing Ukraine to NATO, which on the western part of Russia has the longest border. It's very vulnerable. Russia is very vulnerable, particularly if if Ukraine decide to join NATO, and a host of other issues as well as, after the toppling of Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainians decided to target the Russian speaking people in the Donbass, and even proceeded, in the lead up to 2022 by, removing the Russian language from the curriculum, banning Russian language from being printed in their textbooks. And they also kicked out the Russian Orthodox Church. So this is how it all started, guys. This is how it all started. So the Russians decided enough was enough, and on the 24th of February 2022, Russia decided to launch a full-scale operation, calling it a special military operation in Ukraine. The invasion was met with fierce Ukrainian resistance. Russia failed to take Kiev, and Ukraine later retook some part of the northeast and the south. In 2022, Moscow declared the annexation of four occupied regions, but this was rejected internationally. Now, the war became Europe's largest conflict since the Second World War, with hundreds of thousands killed and millions displaced. The entire cities destroyed. Russia has carried out widespread attack, so has Ukraine, on civilian areas. Like I said, the background to the Russo-Ukrainian War goes back to the post-Soviet ties from 91 to 99, the Budapest Memorandum of 94, with Russia, the US, and the UK pledging to respect its independence and borders. Russia also signed agreements with NATO and Europe guaranteeing states' right to choose alliances. Now, the tensions between the 1990s and 2000s as well, which continued with the Orange Revolution in 2024, which I think during the Orange Revolution, this was when Yulia Tymoshenko, who was the leader at that time, either prime minister or president, ended up being put in jail. So this is the background to how it all started, and we need to understand this. So the Russians are not just, smashing Ukraine willy nilly or doing that without, you know, uh, without any sort of excuse or alibi, if you like. So this is the segue to my conversation about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And the Europeans have insisted that they will continue to arm Ukraine to the teeth in order to beat the Russians and go back to the 1991 lines. And these have not yielded any significant result. So this is where I bring an end to my conversation, 17 minutes long. If you have any question, I expect you to leave it in the comment section. And thank you so much for participating in this part of the conversation. I will host another live stream in this regard later on when people will be allowed to join and ask questions. Again, like I said, if you have any question in relation to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska, the future for Ukraine, the prospects of any peace agreement, the demands of the Russians in respect to the Donbass, Crimea, the status of the Russian language, the status of the Russian Orthodox Church, and a host of other issues. I expect you to leave it in the comment section.